All right, Jabosai, good morning. Let us begin. I want to begin by thanking the sponsors for this morning's shir, to thank our Talmud Torah sponsors for the month of Iyar Menachem and Susie Schoenfeld, Le'iloi Nishmos, their grandparents whose beautiful lessons and teachings continue to inspire and live within their children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren. Let me just see, I had the names here, I'm sorry. Moshe ben Shimon Lev Halevi, Soralea bas Dov Ber Halevi, Menachem Mendel ben Dov Ber, Sariyita bas Yaakov Sender, Noach ben Avram, Thega bas Meir, David Shimon ben Yisrael, and Sarah bas Yaakov. We also thank our Week of Learning sponsors, Ari and Haley Lichterman, for dedicating the learning this week. Le'iloi Nishmas, Haley's mother, Linda Kotin, Rachel Leah Bas Ruvain Meir. We thank our DAF sponsors for this morning, Dr. Ron Gartenhouse in memory of his father, Chazan Uri Lipa ben Baruch, Robert and Lizzie Lilienfeld in loving memory of Robert's mother, Madeline Lilienfeld, and Seth and Rachel Rotenberg for dedicating the shir this morning in memory of Seth's sister, Naomi Tova Bas Zev. We hope that first of all, we thank all of our sponsors, and we hope that all of the neshamas have an aliyah and the families a nechama. And I will say with that, let us begin. So we begin a very beautiful sugya, very interesting sugya today, continuing in the halachos of Hatmana, but actually we're going to complete the parak of Hatmana. I will say that the truth is, as you probably have seen throughout Masechah Shabbos, a lot of times when we end topics, we don't really end topics. So we kind of take a little bit. So you're going to see, for example, technically speaking, last parak we concluded the halachos of muktzah. Yet you see that the halachos of muktzah are still continuing. This parak, today we're going to complete the halachos of hatmana, the insulation. Yet we're going to see hatmana come up again. There's a lot of overlap in the various topics of the various prakim of Shabbos. So again, but at least we'll formally close the parak today. So the Mishnah is also, so you'll see Yashkach to Moshe Abramson for leading the davening today. Mamish all the way from Poland. From the, I don't know if you saw his that's, I think so far takes the cake in Zoom backgrounds. That's the, what you see over there, that's the Ger Rebbe's Beis Medrash in Ger, Poland. We were, Moshe and I, together with the group, were there this summer. Mamish could imagine the vitality. I think it's a great zchus that we made a minion there this morning, at least a little bit. All right, so with that, let us begin. So says the Mishnah, Lo kisumi ba'od yom, lo yichasana mishatachsha. So we've learned this halach already before. That remember, in the world of hatmana, so there are two different types of insulations. There's a davar hamosif hevel and a davar no mosif hevel, something that increases heat and something that maintains heat. So remember, at no point in time are you ever permitted to insulate a pot with a davar hamosif hevel, something that increases heat. That is never permitted. It's not permitted even if you do it on Erev Shabbos, certainly on Shabbos. To insulate the pot with a davar hamosif, with davar shena mosif hevel, to insulate a pot with material which sustains heat, that is permitted on Erev Shabbos, but lechatchila one can't do that on Shabbos itself. So says the Mishnah, lo kisumi ba'od yom. So let's say one did not insulate their pot on Erev Shabbos. So what's the halacha? Lo yichasenu mishatech shach. So you can't do it on Shabbos itself. So remember again, actively insulating a pot for the first time on Shabbos, lechatchila on Shabbos, one is not permitted to do. What happens, however, kisol v'niskala? What happens if you did cover your pot? Halach. So first of all, take a look at Rashi. Rashi says lo yichasanu mishatech shach haparishna taima parak beis nipnei ma amru in tomim b'davar shena mosif hevel ve'shech hashecha kazer shamei asiach. So we'll say this is actually very important because why is it that halacha l'maisa you're not permitted to insulate the pot on Shabbos? What's the concern? So if it's a davar she'ena mosif hevel, to insulate a pot for the first time on Shabbos, even with something that doesn't increase, but just maintains heat, is a concern that you may come to reheat the food on Shabbos. And that could potentially cause a potential Isser D'Oraisa, biblical prohibition of Bishul. However, Kisav and Iskala, what happens if halacha l'maisa, you insulated the food before Shabbos, and then over the course of Shabbos, the insulation falls off. Also remember again, just when you think about insulation, without using too much imagination. The simplest way to imagine this is a towel. Person takes a towel b'pashtos would be a permitted form of insulation, because a towel wrapped around the pot will not increase the temperature of the pot, but will sustain. Remember again, I will say when we speak about insulating a pot, this is a pot off the fire. Right? This is a pot that's been removed from the fire. You can't insulate anything while it's on the fire. So this is taking it off. So you go ahead, you cover the pot with the towel on Erev Shabbos, and then on Shabbos, the towel falls off. So what's the halacha? Mutter lachasoso. You will say in that case, you are permitted to go ahead and recover the pot. In other words, if you did something permitted on Erev Shabbos and insulated the pot in a permitted way on Erev Shabbos, and it becomes uncovered on Shabbos itself, one is permitted to go ahead and recover it on Shabbos day. Next case, memali esakito, venosein lesacha sakar osacha sakes. So this is an interesting case. Now a little bit of a reverse case. You fill up, ketone is a bottle or a pitcher. You fill up a bottle or a pitcher with cold water, and now you place it underneath a pillow or underneath a mattress. Why? In order to retain its coldness. So we'll say here, I actually have a bottle of cold water. I don't want it to get hot. Look at Rashi. So we'll say this is a reverse case. In this case now, I have a cold pitcher of water. I want to go ahead and keep this pitcher cold. I want to keep this pitcher cold. So what do? I want to put it underneath a pillow or underneath a mattress in order to retain its coldness. So we'll say, what's the halacha? The halacha, as the Mishnah says, that is permitted. So we'll say that's a reverse case of hatmana. Up until now, hatmana has always been about going ahead and maintaining heat. A reverse case of hatmana to retain cold. Amar Rabbi Yehuda Shmuel, muter lahatmin esatzonim. So Rabbi Yehuda said in the name of Shmuel, one is permitted to go ahead and insulate food in order to retain its coldness. Rashi says, "Mutar lahatmin esatzonin mipnei achama shelo yichamu v'lo gazunan atu hatmana kidei shichamu." So we'll say we're not concerned that if we allow you to go ahead and insulate something to retain its coldness, you'll come to go ahead and do prohibited hatmana with heat. So the Gemara says, "Rav Yosef, my kamashlan tanina." So I don't say. Rav Yosef says, why do you have to state this? The Mishnah already said this. Memale adam kiton benosein tachas akaro sachas akesa. So the Mishnah already says that's what? That halacha l'maisa. You could take a pitcher of cold water and put it under the pillow or underneath the mattress in order to retain its coldness. Amar le Abaye tuva kamashwan. Abaye says we needed the brisa. I'll tell you why we need the brisa. The imam asnisin, because with the Mishnah statement hava amina hani mili davar shein darko lahatmin. I might have thought from the Mishnah, I might have thought as follows: that halacha l'maisa, when can you do what we'll call cold hatmana? When can you do cold hatmana? Only with a food item that's not normally warmed up. But aval davar shedarko lahatmin lo. But I might have thought that to do cold hatmana with a food item that is normally warmed up, perhaps you can't do. Why? Out of the gzeira that we allow you to do cold hatmana, you may come to do hot hatmana. Kamash malan, that's not the case. Kamash Nabal said that cold hatmana under all circumstances is absolutely and unequivocally permitted. If you look at Rashi says, "Imam asnisen hava mina hanimili kigo mayin tsoninim shein darken lahatmin tachas kar v'tachas v'keses lechamimon shein mischamimin v'kach hilchach lachal megzes." Well, so from the Mishnah, I would have just thought that it's only in a case of like putting a pitcher of cold water underneath a pillow or underneath a mattress. That's going to be permitted because they're both saying that form of temperature preservation is not done with heat. Aval davar shedarko lahatmin lechamim kigon tafshil ema lo yatminena mipnei achama. So I will say, see here the difference. I might have thought from the Mishnah that it's only a manner of hatmana that's only used for cold hatmana that would be permitted. But to go ahead and be matmin something to preserve its cold, but to do so in a way that resembles the way you would insulate something to preserve its heat, I might have thought that that's not permitted. Kamash Malan Rabosai, the Mishnah teaches me, or the Halacha, the Brisa and the Mishnah teach me, that any form of cold hatmana is absolutely permitted. So Rabbi say the isser, or the issue of hatman, of insulation on Shabbos, is only when it comes to preservation of heat. But if you want to quote unquote insulate something to preserve its coldness, halacha l'maisa, that is never a problem on Shabbos, both Erev Shabbos as well as Shabbos. So I'll tell you something very interesting. So the Shulchan Aruch, when it discusses this case in Reish Nun Zayin Sif Vav, actually frames it a little bit differently than the halacha over here. So listen to this. It says, Mutter lahatmin b'Shabbos, davar tzonin, b'davar shena mosif hevel, kadesh lo yitztanin biyoser, o kadesh tafik tzinaso. Both say it's actually very interesting. In the Shulchan Aruch's case, the Shulchan Aruch's case is you are permitted to go ahead and insulate the cold item on Shabbos, provided that it's an insulation that doesn't intensify temperature. But in the Shulchan Aruch's case, you're insulating the cold item so that it shouldn't get colder. Interesting, no? So that it shouldn't get colder. So you're permitted to go and insulate the cold item, kadesh lo yitztane biyoser, in order that it shouldn't get colder, or kadesh tafik tzinaso, so that you take the chill away. So this is what I say. The Shulchan Aruch doesn't even bother, quote unquote, to codify this case that we're learning. Why? Because it's a davar pashut. It's obvious that halacha l'maisa, if you have a cold item and you want to keep it cold, go for it. Go for it. We don't even give this a second thought, which makes sense, because I will say, what's the whole issue of hatmana? What's the whole concern? The whole concern is that you may come to cook. The whole concern is with the davar mosif, something that intensifies temperature. We're afraid that maybe you're going to use a hot coal. So the whole issue of hatmana is either one of kindling or one of bishul. So when it comes to, you have a cold pitcher of water and you want to keep it cold, so you want to put it under the mattress so that the sun doesn't beat down on it, right? Go, enjoy. Do as much of that as you want. So the Shulchan Aruch doesn't even bother to codify that case. The only case the Shulchan Aruch does bring down is the following case. What if you have a cold item, but you don't want it to get colder? Or you have a cold item that you would like to take off the chill, so you want to insulate that. So that the Shulchan Aruch says you could insulate with a davar she'eno mosif hevel, with an insulation that doesn't intensify heat, but you cannot insulate it with a davar hamosif hevel. Okay, good. We're not finished this. We'll see this more. Rav Huna, asr lahat min esatzonim. So we'll say Rav Huna says that Allah chalamayis. No, you're not permitted to go ahead and insulate something to retain its coldness. One second. V'hatanya, Rebbe hifter lahat min esatzonim. But 1 second, Rebbe said that you are permitted to go ahead and insulate something cold in order to preserve its coldness. Lo kasha, it's not a contradiction. Ha mikamei de l'shame mi Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi. Ha lebasar de l'shame. So both say, Rebbe originally said that halacha l'mayis, you can't insulate a cold item. But then after he heard the ruling of Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi, or actually after he heard from Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi, he permitted insulation of a cold item. What happened with Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi? Well, so watch this story. This is an incredible story. Kihadi Yosef Rebbe. One time Rebbe was sitting, and Va'amar Asra Lahat Min Asat Sonin, and he was giving a halacha shir. And in the halacha shir, they spoke about the halachos of hatmana, the halachos ultimately again of insulation, and they said, when it comes to insulating a cold item, that is permitted. So I'll say, remember again, the pashut pshat in the Gemara is that what we're talking over here is insulating a cold item in order to go ahead and preserve its coldness. That's the pashut pshat. So ultimately, Rebbe was sitting and saying, you can't insulate a cold item, right? Even to preserve its coldness. So we'll say, what will be the svara of that? So we understand the svara. The svara would be, because we're concerned, if we allow you to go ahead and insulate a cold item to preserve its coldness, we're concerned that what? That halacha l'maisa, you may come to perform a prohibited act of hatmana, ultimately again with heat. So I'm going to find the Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi to say, watch this. Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi was there with Rebbe, and he said, Abba hitr lahat min esatzonim. So Rabbi Shmuel Rabbi Yossi said to Rebbe, he said, my father, Rabbi Yossi, permitted insulating a cold item in order to retain its coldness. My father Rabbi Yossi permitted this. So Amar Rebbe said, Kavar Horozaken. If that's the case that your father said this, the elder has already paskined. The elder Rabbi Yossi has already paskined, and therefore Rebbe reversed his position. So Rebbe originally held that halacha lamaisa, you cannot insulate a cold item to retain its coldness. After Rabbi Yishmael told him, by the way, my father, Rabbi Yossi, paskined that you can, Rabbi said, well, if the elder paskined already, I reverse my position. So we'll say, now watch the godless of this story. Amar Papa, Bo urei kama mechavim zeh. Bo say, see how Talmidei Chachamim love each other. Love each other. How so? Shilu Rabbi Yossi Kayim. Remember again, at this point in time, Rabbi Yossi had already passed away, right? Because Rabbi Yishmael had taken his father's place as the Rosh Yeshiva. So Rabbi Yossi had already passed away. But watch this. Shilu Rabbi Yossi Kayim haya kafuf v'yoshev lifnei Rebbe. So Rabbi say, if Rabbi Yossi was alive, he himself would have deferred to Rebbe. Now Rabbi say, why would Rabbi Yossi have deferred to Rebbe? Rabbi Yossi was the greater Talmud Chacham. And right, when he was the Rashi, but Rebbe was the leader of the generation. Rashi says, Haya kafav Yoshev lifnei Rebbe, mipnei kavod hanasiyas. Remember again, Rebbe was the Nasi. Rebbe was the leader of the Jewish people. So we'll say, now watch this story. And this is incredible. Rebbe Yossi was a greater Talmud Chacham than Rebbe. But Rebbe was the Nasi. He was the leader of the generation. As such, had Rebbe Yossi been alive, he would have deferred to Rebbe. Yet, when Rebbe hears, now Rebbe Yossi has already passed away, when Rebbe hears that Rebbe Yossi had paskined, Rebbe defers to Rebbe Yossi. So you see the love between Talmidei Chachamim, right? Rabbi Yossi would have deferred to Rebbe had Rabbi Yossi been alive, and now when Rebbe hears that Rabbi Yossi paskin, he deferred to Rabbi Yossi. So pretty incredible. Pretty incredible. Shilu Rabbi Yossi hayakayim kafaf Yosef Rebbe. If Rabbi Yossi were alive, he would have been literally again. He would have bent himself. He would have been deferential to Rebbe. The Gemara says, "The heart Rabbi Yishmael Rabbi Yossi the mamali makam abosef haya the kafaf Yosef lifnei Rebbe." Because also remember again, Rabbi Shlomo Rabbi Yossi inherited his father's position. He was now the Rosh Yeshiva, and he too is differential to Rebbe. And yet, what V'ka Amar? So I will say, because Rebbe was the Nasi. He was the Nasi. He was the head of the Jewish people. So I will say, even people who were greater Talmidei Chachamim to Rebbe, nevertheless deferred because of the prominence of his position. And yet, what V'ka Amar Kavar Harazakin. And I will say, ultimately again, yet Rebbe himself in his humility deferred to Rabbi Yossi. So we'll say, really, really incredible that sometimes that you see that the true measure of a person and the greatness is their ability to go ahead and kind of tone down the ego. That even though, again, technically speaking, so you could have had Rebbe say, listen, even if your father were alive, ultimately, again, he would have deferred to me, and Rebbe could have asserted his position. Yet he understood that Rabbi Yossi was the greater Talmid Chacham, and therefore he defers to the position of Rabbi Yossi, even though Rabbi Yossi is no longer alive. Very dramatically amazing. Let's go back there. Amli Rav Nachman l'Daro Abdi. I will say another incredible Gemara. Rav Nachman said to Daro, his servant, Atmin li tzonein. So he told him two things, Rabbi say. Number one, do me a favor, insulate this cold pitcher of water for me. So we'll say, remember again, why is he insulating the cold pitcher of water? In order to go ahead and preserve its coldness. And do me a favor, bring me a cup of water that was heated up by the non-Jewish servant or the non-Jewish cook, right? So we'll say, so again, two things happening over here. Rashi says, I see the maya da'achim kfei la'arma shehechmin nachtum nachri ubechol. So we'll say, so again, actually like a baker, right? Go ahead and bring me water that was heated up by the non-Jewish baker. And I will say, now that was being done during the week. So it's two different stories, right? Story number one are two different things. Story number one is that Rav Nachman says to his servant, do me a favor and insulate the cold pitcher of water so that it remains cold. That happened on Shabbos. Story number two, which happened during the week, do me a favor, bring me a cup of water warmed up by a non-Jew. Why did Rav Nachman say these two things? The Gemara says, Shama Rabbi Ami ve'ikbid. Rabbi Ami heard that Rav Nachman did this, and Rabbi Ami was very upset. He thought that Rav Nachman did the wrong thing. So the Gemara says, Amar Rav Yosef, my time, but I don't understand why would Rabbi Ami get upset. Rav Nachman, kirabuse avid. Rav Nachman was just simply paskening like his Rebbeim. Because what did his Rebbeim do? Chada kirab v'chada b'Shmuel. In one case he was passing like Rav, and in one case he was passing like Shmuel. Dam Rabbi Huda Amar Shmuel, mutra lahat min atzonin. So we'll say because Shmuel's on record as saying that halacha l'maisa, like Rabbi Yossi and like others, you are permitted to insulate cold water on Shabbos to retain its coldness. So in that respect, Rav Nachman was passing like Shmuel that you are permitted to do hatmana to a cold item to retain the cold temperature. Kirav, Amarav Shmuel, Amarav Yitzchak, Amarav, Koshu nechal kimoshu chai, ein bo mishum bishulin nachim. So we'll say a fascinating halacha. There is a concept of bishul akum. Bishul akum means that you cannot eat food that was cooked by a Gentile. This is part of a series of halachos that are meant to discourage intermarriage. So remember again, there's a concept, food brings people close. That we know, food brings people close. So Chazal legislated that we do not want a Jew eating food cooked by a non-Jew, even if the food is ingredient-wise kosher. Rabbi said this has nothing to do with kashrus. So let's say the non-Jew prepares a cholent, and not just a cholent, like a Haimish cholent. There's kishka, there's kugel, there's everything in there, right? Mamish, like, kodesh kadoshim. So even though, again, there's not a kashrus issue, you are not allowed to eat food cooked by a non-Jew. I have a concern that if I eat food cooked by a non-Jew, that can engender relationships. Relationships lead to intermarriage. But Rabbi say, interestingly enough, Rav says, that's called bishul akum. Rav says the halachos of bishul akum do not apply to something that could be eaten in an uncooked state. Something which can be consumed raw is not subject to halachos of bishul akum, which makes sense, because if something could be consumed in an uncooked state, then the act of cooking hasn't really done all that much to the item. And if the act of cooking hasn't done that much to the item, then the concern of socialization or ultimately intermarriage, according to Rav, is not there. Water, Abosai, is a good example of an item which could be consumed uncooked as well. Therefore, again, Rav Nachman was showing that the halachos of bishul akum do not apply to water. So therefore, Abosai, Rav Nachman, through his instructions to his servant Daru, was teaching us two halachas. Number one, that you are permitted to go ahead and insulate cold water on Shabbos to preserve its coldness. Cold insulation is not a problem on Shabbos. And number two, that bishul akum does not apply to anything which can be consumed raw. If that's the case, then why does Rabbi Ami get all upset from Rav Nachman? Rabbi say an incredible statement. Savar, who savar adam chashav sheni. Rabbi Ami thought that an adam chashav, an important person, is different. An important person, Rabbi say, must conduct himself in a different kind of standard. That an important person, sometimes his behavior has to be above the fray. Look at Rashi, Adam Chashav Shaini, Sharoha also, Shumekel, Omedu Mekel Yosef. You have to understand the way it works, right? When I see an Adam Chashav do something, when I do Adam Chashav, so what do I assume? I assume his behavior is the behavior of an Adam Chashav. So what does that do? In my mind, for me, that creates a ceiling. But the good news is, I'm not an Adam Chashav. Therefore what? I could observe a level of behavior somewhere beneath that. Human nature. Right? So I see the tzaddik, I see the Adam Chashav living up here. I'm not an Adam Chashav. I could live over here. Therefore, what Rabbi Ali was concerned about is that if people see Rav Nachman behaving in this way, doing cold hatmana, they may come to erroneously draw their own conclusions about hot hatmana. Or for that matter, if these say Rav Nachman drinking water heated up by a non-Jew, then at the end of the day, remember Rabbi said, the other concern is people don't always know the intricacies of the halacha, so they draw their conclusions just based on what they see. So if they see Rav Nachman drinking water heated up by a non-Jew, they don't know the whole cheshbon, that this is water that, is an item that could be consumed raw. If it could be consumed raw, it's not subject to bishul akum, so on and so forth. They don't know all these cheshbonos. So in their mind, what do they see? They see Rav Nachman is eating something that was cooked by a non-Jew. And they'll draw their own conclusions. They see Rav Nachman insulating something on Shabbos. It's cold insulation. People say not every. First of all, in general, you don't know all the details when you see someone doing something. So therefore, Rabbi Ami felt with Nachman, you can't do that. You can't do that. As an Adam Chashuv, you are obligated ultimately, again, to hold your behaviors to a different standard. I will say, if you think about this, there's a very powerful mussar in this. And I will say the truth is, each of us is an Adam Chashuv, right? We're all important. We're all important. And so the ability to live life in a way where your actions are beyond reproach. And I will say, to live in a way that someone could look at my life and no matter what I'm doing, my actions kind of stand on their own. They don't require any hasbara. I will say a lot of times the things that we do in life, my actions need Rashi, need Tosas, need explanation to why it is okay, why it's not problematic. To be able to live a life where my actions just simply stand on their own. But if somebody were to look into my life, so my actions are beyond reproach. That was what Rabbi Ami was saying to Rav Nachman. That's the kind of life you have to live. That your actions should be able to stand on their own. And I think we would all agree that it's not for Rav Nachman. However, we can all live lives like that, where if somebody were to look at a freeze frame of our day, no matter when it was, we wouldn't have to tighten up our actions. Right? We wouldn't have to give the Rashi, the Tosas, the Shulchan Achronim, why this is not really wrong, but why it's actually really okay. To be able to live a life that ultimately, again, no matter when someone looks at my actions, they stand on their own, they don't require additional explanation. It's clear that my actions are good, my actions are correct, is a standard we should all aspire to. Tan Rabbanon. So back to the Kor Halachos of Hatmana. Even though we said that in general, you are not permitted to insulate with a davar she'ina mosef hevel mishechashecha. So remember again, once Shabbos starts, you can't insulate anything at all. Anything at all. Right? That's it. No insulation. So therefore on Shabbos, once Shabbos starts, even to insulate your pot with an item that doesn't increase temperature, just maintains temperature, is going to be problematic. However, in Bala Hosef Mosef, Rabbi say, once you insulated your pot already, if you want to add on more insulation, you are permitted to do so. Again, Rabbi say, obviously you're permitted to do so in a way that doesn't run the risk of raising the temperature of the pot. For example, Rabbi Shimon Omer, notin es asadinin umaniach hasagluf karin. We'll say, for example, if you went ahead and you covered your pot with sheets, you could remove the sheets and you could go ahead and replace it with coats. Oh, not lasagluf karin, you could remove the coats. Umaniach hasadinin. So we'll say, so the chiddush over here is, once you've insulated in a permitted way on Erev Shabbos going into Shabbos, you could even switch out the insulation on Shabbos itself. So you could remove insulation A and replace it with insulation B. But if you look at Rashi says over here, Lo asru, lahatbim meshecha shecha ela b'mecham shuch mubo, das mudika. I'm sorry, actually not yet. The previous Rashi, excuse me. Ein tomlin esacham shecha shecha va'afilu b'davar she'en mosvevel kidarmin shem yotze kiderasat sanes kshir tzlatmana. However, aval imbala hosif kisa meshecha shecha mosif. So we'll say, so the halacha is ultimately, again, once you went ahead and you insulated in a permitted way, even on Shabbos itself, you can come to go ahead and switch the insulation. So you could swap insulation. So Rashi points out, for example, where would this come up? Let's say, Abba, say you insulated your pot with coats, which are heavier, but then you're actually concerned your food is going to burn. You could swap that out for a lesser form of insulation. So the Gemara goes weiter. So the Gemara says, Reb Shimon also used to say, that Rabbi say, now this is actually not related to the previous statement, it's just another kula in Hatmana, like Rashi says, Lo asru ela osa mecham. But it's a very interesting halacha. When did the halachos ultimately, again, of Hatmana apply? That's only when you're being matmin, you're doing Hatmana in the very pot in which the food was cooked. However, avapina mimecham lamecham. But I will say, watch this case. Let's say you took the contents from pot A. Now pot A is the pot you cooked the food in. And then what did you do? You emptied pot A, the contents, into pot B. What's the halacha? Mutter. One is permitted to go ahead and be matmin. On Shabbos, one will be permitted to go ahead and insulate that part of those. So we'll say, now watch this. What Rabbi Shimon is saying is an incredible chiddush. Rabbi Shimon is saying like this. When do we say that you can't do Hatmana on Shabbos? Actually, Hatmana on Shabbos, that's when we're talking about the pot in which the food was cooked. So, for example, let's say on Shabbos, right, you have a pot of food, you take it off the fire on Shabbos, now you want to wrap it. You can't do that on Shabbos. But what can you do? If you take the contents of pot A and pour it into pot B, and you now want to wrap up, you want to insulate pot B, you're permitted to do that on Shabbos. Why? Why is that? Listen to this. Because hashta akuri kamakir lo arsuche kamar sichla. Because listen to this. Because remember, what's the whole concern? Why is it in general that you can't do hatmana on Shabbos? Why not? Because we're concerned that you may come to reheat the contents of the pot. You may come to put it back on the fire and reheat the contents of the pot. So Rabosai, once you are going ahead and moving the contents of the pot from pot A to pot B, by definition, you are cooling down the food. Because remember again, pot A, which is the pot that was used to cook the food, is always hotter than pot B because pot A still has the residual heat of the cooking in the walls. Once you transfer the contents of pot A to pot B, it's fundamentally clear that you have no intention of reheating the contents of the pot. If that's the case, then the entire concern with insulating a pot on Shabbos has been obviated, and therefore one would be permitted to actually go ahead and insulate pot B on Shabbos. An incredible chiddush. I mean, it's really not such a chiddush. In other words, once you're transferring the contents of pot A into a different pot, Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says, there's no concern you're going to come to reheat it because you've already fundamentally cooled the food down by transferring it into a different pot. The Gemara says, Taman v'kis u'davar nitel b'Shabbos. We'll say, switching gears again. What happens if you went ahead and you insulated the pot? We'll say, so just there are two things happening over here. Taman, in this case, means you're insulating the pot. You're covering the pot. Kisa means you're covering the top of the pot. So in this case, for example, imagine there's no lid on the pot. So we'll say, so if you taman v'kis u'davar nitel b'Shabbos, so if you went ahead and you insulated and you covered the pot with an item that can be moved on Shabbos, a non-muktzah item, O taman bedavar sheino nitel b'Shabbos, or you went ahead and you insulated the pot with an item that is muktzah. However, kisa bedavar hanitel, but you cover the top of the pot with a non-muktzah item. Harei zenotul machzir. And we'll say what you could do is you could lift the pot out and you could go ahead and put it back. So we'll say the idea over here is if you could imagine the hatmana surrounding the sides and maybe the bottom of the pot, the hatmana item is muktzah, so that can't be moved. But as long as the kisui, the cover, can be moved, not a problem. Take out the pot, and you could put it back into the hatmana items. So the Gemara says, Taman v'kisa b'davar shelo nitel b'Shabbos. What happens, however, if you insulated the pot and covered the pot with an object that can't be moved on Shabbos? O shetaman b'davar hanital b'Shabbos. V'kisa b'davar shelo nitel b'Shabbos. Or you insulated the pot with an item that can be moved, but you covered it with an item that can't be moved. What's the halacha? So we'll say if the pot was a little bit uncovered, then no tulamachsid. Then we'll say halacha l'maisa, you could take it out, or you could do one of two things. You could move the pot and pour the contents out. Or I will say the idea is with the pot, this is in general with halachos of muktzah, if you could take the pot and move it in a way that the muktzah covering falls off, that's not problematic. So we've seen it already with Hilchos Muktzah, called tiltul min hatzad. Or in general, indirect movement of muktzah. So if you could take, we'll say this happens all the time. There's a book you want to read, but there's a muktzah item on it. So if you could take the book and the muktzah item slides off, that's fine. Same idea over here. If your pot is covered ultimately again with a muktzah cover, so halacha l'maisa, you could pick up the pot or move the pot even if the muktzah cover slides off. V'imla, but I will say if this is not possible, amud beis, eino no tilamachsis. We'll say obviously if there's no way to move the pot without directly handling the muktzah covering or the muktzah atmana, then unfortunately, again, you're out of luck, and halacha l'maisa, you cannot access the food. Rabbi Huda says, Ni'ores shal pishtan daka harei kizevel. Rabbi Huda says, fine pieces of flax, fine pieces of combed flax are like manure, namely, it's the type of hatmana that intensifies heat. Manichin mecham agabe mecham, ukedir agabe kedir. We'll say, it's an interesting machlokes what this case is, but we'll just go to Pashup Pshat. You could put literally, again, one pot on top of another pot, or I should say, mecham is literally a kettle. one kettle on top of another kettle, or a kedera on top of a kedera. However, Manichin Mechal Gabi Mechal Gabi Kedera. Aval. So Rashi changes the girsa, and similarly again, Kedera Gabi Mecham Umecham Gabi Kedera. And you could put a pot on top of a kettle and a kettle on top of a pot. And we'll say V'tach Espia Babatzik. And you could go ahead and seal up the opening, right? Seal up the opening with dough. Seal up the opening with dough. So we'll say, why? So we'll say the idea of sealing up the opening with dough is to retain the heat. And the goal over here, we'll say, is not that the upper pot get heated up, rather, it's in order that the heat of the upper pot remain heated. So we'll say, so just to understand what's happening over here is, in this case, you have a pot or a kettle on top of the fire. What the Gemara now is saying is, halacha l'maisa, if you have another pot that you want to keep warm, you could put that second pot on top of the first pot. Now, I will tell you, this halacha is actually very important for us, but for a different reason as stated by the Gemara. We'll say, in Hilchos Shabbos, when you want to reheat something, but you cannot return it to the fire. Remember, let's go back a little bit. In order to do chazara, right? In order to return an object to the fire on Shabbos, there have to be 5 conditions that are met. Remember again the 5 conditions? Number 1, the fire must be covered. Number 2, the food must be fully cooked. Number 3, the food must be hot. Number 4, you must have had intention when you remove the food from the fire that you're going to put it back. And number 5, you must still be holding onto the pot. Now the truth is, conditions 4 and 5 are somewhat dispensable, right? Even if you didn't have das, and even if you weren't going ahead and having kavanah to put it back, but first 3 are indispensable. The fire must be covered, the food must be fully cooked, and halacha l'maaseh, the food must still be hot. If you don't have those conditions on Shabbos, you cannot return the food to the fire on Shabbos. I will say, this is very halacha l'maaseh. Why? Because let's say again, I have chicken. Shabbos morning, I want to reheat a fully cooked solid food. Can I put it back on the blech? And the answer is clearly no. Why can't I put it on the blech? Because I'm missing one of the big 3, namely, which is what? The chicken is no longer warm. It's cold. It's been sitting in the refrigerator the whole night. So I can't put it back on the blech. So what can I do, Rabbi say? But I want to heat up the chicken a little bit. What can I do? Kedera agabi kedera. Rabbi say that's this case. So I could put my chicken, we'll call that a kedera, that's a pot, even though it's not, or it doesn't really matter what it's in. It doesn't matter if it's in a pan or if it's in another piece of tin foil. And I could put that on top of another pot that is on top of the blech. That's the kedera agabi kedera. Or what I could also do is, I could take, let's say, a pot, turn it over, put that on the blech, and then put the chicken on top of that blech. Or I could put the chicken on top of the crock pot, right? The crock pot is sitting on top of that. So we'll say, so that's the case of kedera gabe kedera. So when you don't have the right, the halachic right, to put an item back on the blech on Shabbos, you could go ahead and put it on top of a pot that is situated on the blech. Now, I just want to point out, this concept is dafka reserved for fully cooked solids. Reheating liquids on Shabbos is exceptionally problematic. The only time you could heat up a liquid on Shabbos would be is if you could heat it up in a way to take off the chill. You can go ahead and heat it up in a way that it's going to be yatzol at this point. Remember, we learned you can't put liquid in a place where it has the capacity to become yatzol at this point, even if your intention is just to take off the chill. So we'll say that's this case of kedera al gabi kedera, putting one pot on top of another pot, which is exceptionally halacha l'maaseh, because for many of us it is how we are able to warm up fully cooked solids on Shabbos morning. So the Gemara goes weiter. The Gemara says, "Kshem shein tones achamin, kach ein tones atzin." Now this opinion holds the same way that you can't insulate something to retain its heat, you also can't go ahead and insulate something to retain its coldness. Rebbe hit to the hatin sasra. We'll say by Rebbe, we saw this before. Rebbe paskind, which is how we paskin halacha l'maisa, you are permitted to insulate something cold in order to retain its coldness. But another interesting halacha, which we're going to see a little bit later. Ve'meraskin loas hashelag v'loas habarad b'shabbos v'shel she'azov meimar. We'll say you cannot crush snow or crush hail, crush ice on Shabbos in order to turn it into liquid. Can't do that on Shabbos. Rashi says, why not? What's wrong with this? Emiraskin, Rashi says, Kimamiraskin mishabim lechatichos dakos, kadir shesomeo mishum dekamolid b'Shabbos, v'dami lemalacha, shebori hamayim ha'ilu. So Rashi says, the problem with crushing snow, ice, hail, and making water is what? Nolad. Ultimately, again, you're creating something new. You're creating something new. So because you're creating something new, Allah said that's Asr on Shabbos. It has the appearance of a malacha. But what can you do? But what you can do is, you could put ice into your, Rashi says, into your cup. But I will say, what kind of cup? Rashi says, Shal yayin b'mosacham b'kedei va'afapishin imuach me'ela ve'eno choshesh. I will say, what you can do is, you could put ice into your drink on Shabbos. The ice is going to melt. That's okay, because the melting of the ice, Rashi points out over here, is ultimately, I guess, it melts by itself and there's no choshes. Rabbi says, so apparently, the problem on Shabbos is doing something to actively melt an item, to actively melt snow, to actively melt ice. That's problematic. But however, to put it in your drink and to let it dissolve by itself, that is not problematic on Shabbos. Hadrun alach b'matam rabosai mazel tov. Mazel tov, mazel tov. Let's go weiter. Now we have another beautiful, beautiful parak ahead of us. So we'll say, we're going back a little bit to the halachos of hotzah. Remember again, we started out this parak by speaking about the halachos of carrying. We're going back now, but now, interestingly enough, we're speaking about carrying vis-a-vis one's animal on Shabbos. Here we go. So we'll say, what could, and now remember, let's a word of introduction here. There is a concept of Shabbos, on Shabbos, of shvisas behema. Your animal must rest on Shabbos the same way that you must rest. That's the halacha. So therefore, my animal can't work on Shabbos. I know that's right. We can't work our animal on Shabbos. Included in that Rabbosai of work is an animal, quote unquote, carrying or wearing anything that's non-essential. So if an animal goes out on Shabbos wearing something non-essential, that is hotzah, right? That is a problem of the animal, quote unquote, carrying. Rabbosai, obviously, there's no chiyuv on the part of the animal. The chiyuv is, for me, the owner of the animal. So therefore, the Mishnah asks, with what can an animal go out on Shabbos, and with what can it not go out? Look at Rashi. A person is obligated to make sure that his animal rests on Shabbos. So we'll say anything that is necessary for the animal's protection. Now, protection could literally mean protection, but protection also means anything that is necessary for me to lead the animal. So we'll say, you can say like a leash. Anything that's necessary for me to lead the animal is considered to be part of the animal and not carrying. Velo havi masui, umidi delo mintirabe havi masui. I will say ultimately again, but anything that doesn't quote unquote protect the animal. So we'll say again, remember, protection doesn't mean protection like to protect it from harm. Protection means allows me to lead the animal so that the animal doesn't go astray and ultimately again get into trouble. So the Gemara says, so therefore let's go through the list. So the Gemara says, Hagama ba'afsar. So a gamal could go out with an afsar. We'll say afsar literally is translated as a halter. So we'll say, so again, so for the gamal, for the animal, this is a piece of rope that ties around its head and its mouth, and you lead the camel out like that. V'na'aka b'chatam. We'll see what a na'aka is. A na'aka goes out with a chatam. Now we'll say, chatam is a nose ring. We'll see what that means in the Gemara. V'luvdikim, and luvdikim go out b'prumbia. Prumbia, we'll say, is a bit, right? Which is something that's tied in the mouth of the animal. We'll see what luvdikim are. V'susim b'shir. And a sus ultimately again goes out with the shear. So we're going to see, Rashi says, shear is kimo etzadas saviv tzavaro v'tabas kavava umachnisa baratzua ochevel moshe mehema. So we're going to see that a shear is a collar, right? First goes out with a collar. V'chol bali asher yotzim b'shir, and any animal that is normally led with a collar goes out with a collar on Shabbos. V'nim shachan b'shir, they're led with a collar. Umazin alayhu. This is very interesting. What happens if the collar becomes ritually impure through contact with the corpse? The Mishnah is telling me you don't have to take the collar off of the animal in order to purify it. But rather, again, you could purify the collar while the animal is still in it. The tovlin bin koman is very interesting. Furthermore, let's say the animal becomes tamei. But say, listen to this. You don't have to take the collar off the animal to immerse it in the mikvah. Instead, what can you do? Rashi, look at Rashi. You could take the entire animal into the mikvah, immerse the animal with the collar still on it, and the collar becomes tar. Right? Maybe you could die to use the mikvah first, right, before animal hour. Then we'll say, but lemaisa, what you see over is something quite fascinating. We'll see this in the Gemara, but the idea being is that halacha lemaisa, if the collar needs to be purified, either through hazah, through sprinkling of part, this is by paraduma, right, or by immersion in the mikvah, you could sprinkle or immerse the collar while the animal is still on it. Good. Says the Gemara. So now we're going to define our terms. My naka b'chotim. So we'll say, so I understand what a gamal. A gamal is a camel, and a hafsar is the halter. I understand that. What's a naka? My naka chivarti. So we'll say, apparently, again, it's a white camel. So again, this was a different breed. So apparently, again, this is some type of Arabian camel, and these camels were much more wild. They're more lebedik camels. So because of that, bizamama de parzala, they would be led ultimately again with an iron nose ring. So whereas a regular camel, you could put it like on this halter, which is a type of leash, this white camel, this Arabian camel, was a bit more lebedik, a bit more wild, and therefore you had to lead it with a nose ring. It required a much starker type of leading. The luvdikim b'promiyah. What's a luvdikim? So the Gemara says, Amrafuna chamra luba. So we'll say this is a donkey, a Luvian donkey, right? This Luv was a place. Rashi says, Chamar habam medinas Luv kimo akushim ba'luvim. So we'll say, so apparently this was a donkey that came from Luv, and it was also more lebedig, and therefore bapagi de parzala. Rashi says, Pagi de parzala ke'in shalano. So we'll say, you would lead it with an iron bit. An iron bit. So what's the Gemara tells a story. Levi shadar zuzi lebechozoi lemizban lechamra luba. So we'll say, so what happened? Levi sent money to Bechozoi to buy a Luvian donkey, because Levi thought that Luvian donkeys, mamish, it's like the Lexus of donkeys. So what happened? Tsaru shadrule sari. So we'll say, so what happened? So they got Levi's money and they sent back his money with some barley. Why lememar? The nigri de chamra sari. So we'll say they told Levi. So apparently, we'll say what happened was over here is Bechozai was a very long journey from Levi. So they said to Levi, "You're wasting your money, because if you buy a donkey from us, they're going to deplete the strength of the donkey just with the journey. Instead, what makes a donkey stronger, Bosai? It's how much you feed it. It's how much you feed it. That's what determines the strength of the donkey. So save your money, purchase a local donkey, and just go ahead and what? Go ahead and serve it, right? Feed it good barley. Both say, hear the incredible musar in this. Sometimes we think that our strength is determined by where we come from, right? That our strength is determined by our yichos, by the mishpacha you come from. If you come from a good mishpacha, you have a good upbringing, a solid family, then fantastic. You'll be a great donkey, right? You'll ultimately be very strong and very successful. So what the Gemara is saying is that no, it doesn't actually really matter where you come from. What matters most is what you sustain yourself on. Even if you're a local donkey. I will say, even if halacha l'maisa, I don't have such great yichus, I come from very simple upbringing, maybe even worse, right? Where I come from is actually quite challenging and maybe even a bit deficient. It makes absolutely no difference what your point of origin is. What matters most is how you choose to sustain yourself right now. If you choose to go ahead and sustain yourself on a good diet of barley, of Torah, of mitzvahs, of ruchnias, it makes no difference where you came from. You can become something great if you make the right decisions now. An incredible musar. What to be learned even from the donkeys. Amar Rav Yehuda Shmuel, machlifin lifnei Rebbe, shalzu bezumar. So we'll say, so here's what comes out from the Mishnah. What comes out from the Mishnah is essentially different animals were led different ways. So, for example, a regular donkey, so a regular leash, a regular halter was just enough. Now, I'll say it's not a typical leash. The typical leash that you think about is like a collar, like what a dog has, or for that matter, again, what many other animals had. That's balishir. A camel was different. The camel had a leash, but it was a bit in the mouth. So, right, everything was tied around the mouth. You pulled the camel through. So we'll say, so a regular camel, let's say, for example, it's good enough if you go ahead and you pull it by what we'll call the halter. But yet the Naka, the white donkey, needed a nose ring because the Maisa was more lebedig. So they asked the following Shaila of Rebbe. Rebbe say, what happens if you swapped? You swapped Shalzu Bezu, Naka Ba'afsar. So Rebbe say, so what does that mean? What does that mean? Let's analyze this. So if you led the white donkey with the halter, Lo Tibaylecha. Rebbe say, that's not a Shaila. That's definitely problematic on Shabbos. Why? Kevan de lo minterabe masui havi. So listen to this. If you take a white donkey out on Shabbos, a white camel. If you take a white camel out on Shabbos, right, with a typical camel halter, so Rabbi was saying that is going to be problematic. That is going to be as if you are working your animal on Shabbos. Why? Because Rabbi was saying the typical halter for a white camel doesn't do anything. If it doesn't do anything, if it doesn't help, then Lamaisa, that's a masui. That's as if the animal is carrying a burden. But remember, any time that an animal goes out on Shabbos with something that is not quote unquote beneficial for that animal, that is, excuse me, that is considered as if the animal is carrying a burden. So therefore, to take the white camel out with a simple camel halter will be problematic on Shabbos because the simple camel halter does not do anything for the white donkey. Kiti by the So we'll say, where does the shaila come up? Gamal bechotam mai. We'll say, what about a regular camel? A regular camel, but you use a nose ring. So we'll say, so what is that? What's a regular camel with a nose ring? That's called, we'll say, excessive. Right? So under normal circumstances, if you would put a nose ring in your regular camel, there would be an excessive form of shmir, an excessive form of guarding that animal. Mai. So do we say, since a regular camel would be just fine with the halter, so therefore again the nose ring is a bit excessive, and therefore the nose ring is considered to be like a burden? Do we say no, even though again the nose ring might be a bit excessive for the camel, a regular camel, but lamaisa it's not considered to be a burden. So again, what's here the shaila? The shaila is what we call excessive guarding of the animal, right? So if you lead the animal in a way that's considered to be also called excessive guarding, is excessive guarding considered to be a masui? Is it considered to be a burden or not? That's the shaila. Amar lefanav Rabbi Shmuel Yossi. So Rabbi Shmuel Yossi said, "Kach Amar Abbas." Will say incredible. Two Gemaras, two different prakim. You have Rabbi Shmuel quoting his father. So Rabbi Shmuel Yossi said, "This is what my father said." Arba behemos yotzos ba'afsar. There are 4 animals that go out with the halter, right? With the basic leash that goes around the mouth. Hasus, v'hapered, v'hagamal, v'hachamar. Right? So the horse, the mule, the camel, and the donkey. Lemi'ute, my boss says, what is this coming to exclude? My love, lemi'ute gamal b'chotam, is not coming to exclude the case of a regular camel with a nose ring to teach you that Rabbi says such a thing is considered to be excessive. And because that's excessive, if the animal goes out with it on Shabbos, it's considered as if the animal is carrying a burden. Lo, lemi'ute na'aka ba'afsar. No, what it's coming to actually exclude, Rabbi say, is the case of a white camel with a halter. That if you take out a white camel with a halter on Shabbos, Rabbi say, then what? That's considered to be an act of carrying. Why is it an act of carrying? Why is it, I should say, masui, carrying a burden? Why? Because we'll say the halter for a white camel does absolutely nothing because it doesn't guard it appropriately. Therefore, if the camel goes out with that on Shabbos, that's an act of carrying a burden. B'masnisa tana. So we learned about say luvdikim. Remember again, the luvdikim are the Luvian donkeys. The gamal and a camel yotzin ba'afsar go out with a halter. Ketana. So also indeed this is machlokes tanaim. Ein chaya yotza b'sugar. So we'll say a chaya cannot go out with a sugar. Now we'll say, what's a sugar? Rashi says, kolar, a collar. A collar. So ultimately, again, a chaya, you can't lead a chaya out with a sugar, with a collar. So we'll say, what does this mean? Chananya omer, yotza b'sugar. Chananya says, no, a chaya can go out with a collar. Ubechol davar hamishtamer. And the truth is, you could take a chaya out with anything that could be guarded. But I'm asking, I will say, what's the case? What's the case of the chaya going out with a collar? Watch this. So if you tell me that it's saying that you could lead a chaya gedola out with a collar, mi sagile sugar. Rabbi say, could a chaya gedola go out with a sugar? Could a chaya gedola be let out with a collar? Of course not, Rabbi say. Remember again, a chaya gedola, a real chaya cannot be restrained and cannot be let out with a regular collar. So the Gemara says, "Ve'ela b'chaya kitana." Rather, when we're talking about a small chaya, milo sagile sugar. So the Gemara says, so again, chaya kitana. We'll say everybody agrees that ultimately again it could be let out with a collar. What's the shaila? We'll say, watch this. Ela lav chatul ikabena. We'll say, so what's the machlokes? A cat. Watch this. Tanakama savar kivan disagila b'misna ba'alma masehu. So we'll say a cat. Now a cat does not need a collar. What does a cat need? Says the Gemara. Even a string. The Tanakama will say that since a cat can be led just with a string, a collar is considered to be excessive. And because it's excessive, if the cat goes out with a collar on Shabbos, the owner is liable for putting a burden on his animal. Right? So essentially the Tanakama holds that any type of excessive item on an animal is considered to be a burden. Chananya Savar, Kal Netirusa Yeserasa, Lo Amrinan Masui. Chananya, on the other hand, holds that no, we don't hold that any form of excessive guarding of the animal is not called a burden. So we'll say, you hear what Chananya is saying? Chananya is saying about that the only time that's problematic on Shabbos is if you lead the animal out with something that is considered to be not enough for the animal. So we'll say, for example, you go out and you take the white donkey out. You take the white donkey out with a halter. That's problematic because that's not sufficient to guard the animal. If it's not sufficient to guard the animal, then Allah Lamaisa, that's considered to be as if the animal is carrying a burden. But it says Chananya to go ahead and take an animal out on Shabbos with something that is considered to be excessive guarding, that's not a problem. That's called nitirusa yiserasa. An excessive guarding of the animal on Shabbos is not problematic. So if you were to take out the cat with a collar, a cat doesn't need a collar. A cat just needs a little string. So again, Chananya says, halacha lamaisa, it's okay. It's for the benefit of the animal. Even though it's excessive, it's not considered as if the animal is carrying a burden. Amar Rav Huna bar Chiya, Amar Rav Shmuel, halacha kechananya. And I will say, indeed, the Gemara says that the halacha follows Chananya, that namely, again, taking an animal out with an excessive form of guarding is not problematic. So therefore, again, I will say, if you take an animal out on Shabbos, I'll just say it in layman's term, with a larger leash, more intense leash, stronger leash than this type of animal needs, that's okay. That's not called the animal carrying a burden. Conversely, if you take an animal out on Shabbos with a leash that's not capable of guarding it, that is called a masui. That is, if the animal is carrying a burden, and I am responsible ultimately again for working my animal on Shabbos. So we'll conclude just with a maisa. So the Gemara says, listen to this. Levi breid Rav Huna bar Chiya v'Rava bar Rav Huna hava azli ba'archa. So we'll say, so Levi and Rabba were both traveling together on the road. Watch this. Kadma chamra de Levi lechamra de Rabba. The donkey of Levi cut off the donkey of Rabba bar Rav Huna. Okay. Chalish daite Rabba Rav Huna. Rabba Rav Huna was offended. Why? Because I will say Rabba bar Rav Huna was a greater Talmid Chacham than Levi. And Rabba bar Rav Huna felt slighted. I will say again, if you're traveling with your Rebbe, good to know, if you're traveling with your Rebbe and you're both on donkeys, so what's the halacha? You let your Rebbe's donkey go first. Right? So here, Rabba was a little bit offended because Levi cut him off, right? Levi's donkey went in front, and Rabba felt that it was a slight. So Levi realized what happened. I will say, now Levi didn't do it intentionally, right? Levi just had a lebedik donkey, so the donkey kind of went on its own, but Levi did not mean to cut off Rabba. So Amar Ema le Milsa, Kihechi top of Nun Beis, Kihechi de Isosiv Daite. So Levi said, you know what, let me tell Rabba a good halacha that will calm him down, so that he realized this was not intentional. So the Gemara says, Amar Le, supposed to listen to what Levi says, it's incredible. Amar Le, Chamar Sha'asakav Ra. Levi says, Rebbe, let me ask you a question. What happens if you have a donkey who's very, very bad manners? Sha'asakav Ra, bad midos. A bad donkey. Kigonzeh, like my donkey. Right? My donkey clearly has no midos. Right? Sha'asakav Ra'ah. So what happens? Ma'u lotzis beprumbia b'Shabbos. So let's say I have an ill-mannered donkey. Right? My donkey doesn't listen. It's asakav Ra'ah, bad midos. Can I take my donkey out with a bit in its mouth? I remember, under normal circumstances, putting a bit in the mouth of a donkey is excessive. A donkey doesn't need a bit, right? A donkey just needs a halter. It doesn't need a bit. So you hear the Shaila? Levi's asking Rabbah, can I take my donkey out on Shabbos? This type of donkey, which has bad midos, as you could see. You see, my donkey lacks midos. My donkey cut in front of your donkey. Can I take such a donkey out like this with a form of excessive guarding on Shabbos? You know, your father said in Shmuel that what? The halacha follows Chananya, namely what Rabbi say? That halacha lemaisa, you could take an animal out even with excessive shmira, excessive guarding on Shabbos. And Rabbi say that indeed is the halacha. You could take a donkey, you could take an animal out on Shabbos even with a more extreme form of guarding on Shabbos, and it's not considered as if the animal is carrying a burden. On the flip side, if you take the animal out on Shabbos with a type of shmira that does not properly guard the animal, that is considered as if the animal is carrying a burden, and the owner will be liable. So I will say, through this shaila, someone we see the halacha, but also Levi was able to demonstrate ultimately again to Rabbah that he did not intentionally cut off Rabbah's donkey, but unfortunately, again, the lack of kavod was unfortunately due to the impetuous nature of Levi's donkey. All right, we'll stop over here. Emir Hashem, we pick up tomorrow. Emir Hashem, right there in the basement. Aleph 5:45 Mesilas Yesharim, 5:55 Daf Yomi, 6:45 Shachris, and Mincha is tonight at 7:50 p.m. Have a wonderful day. Shkach Rabosai.